Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the proceedings this afternoon. My name's John Smeaton. I'm the Chief Executive of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, which is one of the three bodies which is organising this event this afternoon. Also the Latin Mass Society. Joe Shaw, from whom we'll be hearing later, is the chairman, and Good Counsel Network. And we have Claire McCulloch here, who's the founder and director of Good Counsel Network. She and her husband, Stuart, couldn't be with us, unfortunately, but we're very delighted that all of you can come. But before I say anything more, I'm going to ask Father Pilari to come and begin the whole proceedings with a prayer and perhaps a few words of his own.
Thank you, John. Yes, and just before I lead the prayer, I wanted to say a special word of gratitude to all of you on behalf of the clergy. As a priest, I really wanted to thank you for the excellent work the Good Counsel Network does, the Latin Mass Society, and of course SPUC, and in a particular way for making the sacrifice of your time of work to put on this conference and to come here. I'm very much looking forward to hear what Tom will be presenting to us, as well as Joseph and John. But thank you to each one of you for the work you're doing on behalf of children. As a priest, the children are among our most precious treasures that we're called to really safeguard and defend and protect. And so on behalf of the clergy, I really want to thank each one of you for the work you're doing. That's a tremendous help for our own work as spiritual fathers on their behalf. So if you would please rise for a moment and face Our Lady, we'll begin with the prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady of Walsingham, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Thank you. Well, I referred to this grand coalition organising this event, but without Maria, Medice and Selina producing lovely things to express, I think, in a beautiful way, what we're all about, we wouldn't be here. And the first thing, obviously, you should all have your programme. And Maria and Selina were very concerned that you should make sure you've still got them tomorrow, because it shows the different events that are taking place and where. Not that complicated, but if you're anything like me, I'm always wanting to look at the programme again and again and again, however short it might be. And then, of course, we've got all the different parts of our prayers that we'll be saying during the course of the weekend set out there. And there's a little book stall at the back which has got, amongst other things, I think things from the Latin Mass Society. There's this paper here, which is been written by Dr. Tom Ward, and who is speaking to us this afternoon. Sorry, Dr. Tom Rogers, I do beg your pardon. Well, you can see how I made that mistake, can't you? Come on. Anyway, so if you don't remember everything Tom has said, I'm sure he'll be saying things which are not in here. This will be a useful thing to read, I would say, in the 24 hours after today, and it will be there permanently. And this is not the latest edition of Calx Mariae, the publication of Voice of the Family, which is produced both with, I think, very learned and interesting content, and again expressing the truth also through the beauty of the publication. This is not the latest one. The latest one comes out tomorrow or Monday. And yes, have you got the first copy there? Very good. You've got one copy. So do look out for that, because it's very much designed to help Catholics through this terrible period through which we're going, and particularly on matters relating to life and the family. So it just behoves me to say a few words about the purpose of our pilgrimage, first of all, which, as you know, is to ask Our Lady to pray that God will transform the Catholic bishops of England and Wales in particular, so that they lead the Catholic faithful in resistance to the British government's wicked legislation which makes relationships education compulsory at primary school and relationships and sex education compulsory at secondary school, including compulsory LGBT relationships at secondary level. We're very few here in number, but that was actually part of the plan, in that we foresaw that in the first development of this initiative, it would bring together people who are already, I think, in a mature way, aware of the terrible crisis we're going through, the very poor leadership that we are experiencing at present in the church, and the impact that has on us as people seeking to be, however imperfectly, faithful Catholics. There is a sense in which I think faithful Catholics are actually being persecuted at present by church leaders, both in Britain and around the world, and our children, unfortunately, I can't think of another word for it, corrupted. So that's the purpose of our pilgrimage, to pray to Our Lady to transform. If I can just say this, that I was working it out. It's about 22, 23 years ago that I first became engaged in this particular battle, first of all to protect our own children, Josephine's and mine. Josephine is here with me, I'm happy to say. And then it went on, and we formed Safe at School, because I thought, well, I felt very isolated, and I thought, well, everybody's going to be isolated. And so through our professional team, we developed Safe at School. And I've often written about the sorts of things we're dealing with at this conference this afternoon. I had a blog, well, I still have a blog, on which I used to write a lot about this. And I went to Rome any number of times to talk to leading prelates, and didn't get anywhere. I remember one particular meeting with Cardinal Willett, who's head of the Congregation for Bishops, and he said to me at the beginning of our discussion, well, I don't usually meet people like you, Mr. Smeaton. I usually meet diplomats and ambassadors. And there was a bit of a silence, and I said, well, I'm sure I'm very grateful, Your Eminence. He said, oh, no, I'm interested in what you have to say, but can you just tell me this? Why is it that you think you're the chief executive of a secular organisation, that you have the right to pronounce judgment on the Catholic bishops? I said, well, thank you for that, Your Eminence. I'm grateful for what you've said. I shall reflect on that, if I may. I said, but could I just ask you what one is supposed to do when, for example, the Archbishop of Southwark has said that Stonewall, a militant homosexual anti-Catholic organisation, can come in to train teachers on how to present issues about homophobia to children at primary school as young as 4 and 5, telling teachers that they can say to little boys that they might grow up to marry a man, or a little girl that she might grow up to marry a woman. And he said, well, yes, he said, well, of course it is very difficult for the bishops because of they do rely on the government to provide funding for the schools. And I said, well, surely if one can't preach the gospel, one should close the schools. And there was no further response from him there. But you know the sort of thing then that you're up against at the highest, or nearly the highest level of the church. So what I'm saying is that over those nearly 25 years, I suppose, one hasn't got very far in first of all, well, things have got worse over that 25 years. And what's more, there isn't a great upsurge of Catholic faithful really active on this. People who are dealing with this problem are still feeling very isolated wherever they are. It seems to be part of God's plan that everyone is on their own in wherever they are. I wish we all lived in the same town and we could all work together and march off to another town, but that isn't the way God has planned it. So we are by definition a small group, and I thought it was best to start, we thought it was best to start with this small group and then see how it goes. And if you like, having got nowhere, as a last resort, and I put that in quotation marks, appeal to Our Lady, actually, to do the work for us. Of course, that is where we should have always started. So that's the purpose of our pilgrimage, to pray to Our Lady to transform the bishops. But I think it's important just to say a few words about the global ecclesiastical context right now in which we're working. Because sadly, as you know, the bishops have repeatedly welcomed this terrible legislation, as Tom will be making clear in his presentation shortly. And indeed, the position of the bishops is terrible in other ways as well. However, the scandalous reality is that the bishop's policy is very much in line with papal and Vatican policy, and it's partly in line with the policy of bishops worldwide as reflected, for example, by the 2015 Family Synod. As a matter of fact, in the interim report, the Relatio Post the interim report of the Extraordinary Synod of 2014 and the preparatory document of the Instrumentum Laboris of the Ordinary Synod in 2015, there were passages that suggested that homosexual unions, while not equal to marriage, nonetheless have some form of legitimacy, some degree of legitimacy. The Synod Fathers, the bishops from around the world, rejected this approach, and no such passages were found in the final reports of either synod. The rejected approach, however, was reintroduced in Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, Pope Francis's post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which states in paragraph 52 that, and I quote, "We need to acknowledge the great variety of family situations that can offer a certain stability, but de facto or same-sex unions may not be equated with marriage." Now, this implies that same-sex unions are one of the great variety of family situations. The same-sex unions offer a certain stability, and that same-sex unions can be equated with marriage on some level, if not simply. They can't simply be equated with marriage, is what the words were of that apostolic exhortation. Furthermore, the paragraph states that, and I quote, "Only the exclusive and indissoluble union between a man and a woman has a plenary role to play in society as a stable commitment that bears fruit in new life." To state that marriage has a plenary role necessarily means that other forms of union do have some positive role to play in society. In a lecture entitled 1517, 1717, 1917, Three Revolutions and Fatima, delivered in Washington in 2017, Professor de Bataille, the distinguished church historian, said, and I quote, "At Fatima, Our Lady showed the three little shepherds the terrifying vision of hell where the souls of poor sinners go, and it was revealed to Jacinta that it was sins against purity that lead most souls to hell. Who could possibly have imagined 100 years later that the public profession of impurity would have been added to the immense number of impure sins that are committed under the form of sexual liberation and the introduction of extramarital unions, even homosexuals, into the laws of the most important nations in the West?" And Professor Roberto de Bataille continued, "And who could have imagined that a pontifical document, Pope Francis's post-synodal apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia, issued on the April 8th, 2016, would endorse adultery? The divine and natural law does not admit exceptions. In one of the dubia addressed by cardinals to the Pope, we read, after Amoris Laetitia number 301, is it still possible to affirm that a person who habitually lives in contradiction to a commandment of God's law, as for instance the one that prohibits adultery, finds him or herself in an objective situation of grave habitual sin? The fact, Professor de Bataille writes, that today a sort of doubt of this kind can be presented to the Pope and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith indicates how very grave and deep is the crisis in which the Church is immersed. On the 24th of October 2015, 94% of the bishops and cardinals attending the ordinary synod of the family in Rome voted to approve a paragraph in the final report which rejects the right of parents to choose to be the sole educators of their children in sexual matters. This is me speaking now, not Professor de Bataille. The sentence in paragraph 58 of the document reads, and I quote, "The family, while maintaining its primary space in education, cannot be the only place for teaching sexuality." This paragraph is directly contrary to the teaching of the Catholic Church. In his encyclical Sapientiae Christianae of the 10th of January 1890, on the chief duties of Christians as citizens, Pope Leo XIII teaches, and I quote, "By nature, parents have a right to the training of their children, and with this added duty that the education and instruction of the child be in accord with the end for which, by God's blessing, it was begotten. Therefore, it is the duty of parents to make every effort," Pope Leo wrote, "to prevent any invasion of their rights in this matter, and to make absolutely sure that the education of their children remain under their own control in keeping with their Christian duty, and above all," he writes, "to refuse to send them to those schools in which there is a danger of imbibing the deadly poison of impiety." It's number 26 of the encyclical. Pope Leo XIII's words are given greater weight by virtue of their being cited by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri on Christian education of the 31st of December 1929. In this encyclical, Pope Pius XI goes on to say, this is number 65, Another very grave danger is that naturalism, which nowadays invades the field of education in that most delicate matter of purity of morals. Far too common, he writes, is the error of those who with dangerous assurance and under an ugly term propagate a so-called sex education, falsely imagining that they can forearm youths against the dangers of sensuality by means purely natural, such as a foolhardy initiation and precautionary instruction for all indiscriminately, even in public. And worse still, by exposing them at an early age to the occasions in order to accustom them, so it is argued, and as it were to harden them against such dangers. Pope Leo XI continues, Pope Pius XI continues, such persons grievously err in refusing to recognise the inborn weakness of human nature and the law of which the Apostle speaks, fighting against the law of the mind. And also in ignoring the experience of facts, from which it is clear that particularly in young people, evil practices are the effect not so much of ignorance of intellect as of weakness of a will exposed to dangerous occasions and unsupported by the means of grace. He continues in words which would seem in a way quite obvious to us as parents. In this extremely delicate matter, if all things considered, some private instruction is found necessary and opportune from those who hold from God the commission to teach and who have the grace of state, every precaution must be taken. Such precautions are well known in traditional Christian education and are adequately described by Antoniano on the Christian education of youth, which St. Charles Borromeo ordered to be read in public to parents assembled in their churches. He adds elsewhere in his encyclical. When Antoniano says, such is our misery and inclination to sin, that often in the very things considered to be remedied against sin, we find occasions for and inducements to sin itself. Hence, he writes, it is of the highest importance that a good father, while discussing with his son a matter so delicate, should be well on his guard and not descend to details, nor refer to the various ways in which this infernal hydra destroys with its poison so large a portion of the world. Otherwise it may happen that instead of extinguishing this fire, he unwittingly stirs or kindles it in the simple and tender heart of the child. Speaking generally, during the period of childhood, it suffices to employ those remedies which produce the double effect of opening the door to the virtue of purity and closing the door upon vice. Pause for a short commercial. We've got a Rome Life Forum next May, which is actually entitled Opening the Door to the Virtue of Purity and Closing the Door upon Vice. Now, the teaching of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius XI was also upheld by Pope Pius XII in an address to French fathers on the 18th of September 1951. The words of these popes are steeped in divine law, in apostolic teaching and the tradition of the church, and steeped too in a sensitive and holy knowledge of the reality of the constant battle between good and evil in the soul of every human being. Compare this teaching to the position now adopted by the Vatican and Pope Francis. A few months after the promulgation of Amoris Laetitia, an apostolic exhortation in which Pope Francis called for sex education in educational institutions, without reference at all in that section to parents. The Pontifical Council for the Family published a sex education programme called The Meeting Point at the World Youth Day in Poland, July 2016. This programme, which is intended to be taught in schools in mixed classrooms, adopts a secularised and secularising approach and exposes children to obscene and pornographic images. Compare these words of our earlier popes to the teaching of the Catholic bishops of England and Wales, who in a training document for teachers have said that, and I quote, an exalted form of love exists just as powerfully in relationships between people of the same sex as it does in heterosexual relationships. We must also compare these three popes to the following words from Pope John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio, his apostolic exhortation on the family in 1981, which very much fail to convey the full teaching of the Church on the sacred obligations of parents to guard their children from temptation. He wrote in famous words, "Sex education, which is the basic right and duty of parents, must always be carried out under their attentive guidance, whether at home or in educational centres chosen and controlled by them. In this regard, the Church reaffirms the law of subsidiarity, which the school is bound to observe when it cooperates in sex education by entering into the same spirit as animates the parents." What do Catholic parents do when popes disagree on sex education? The answer must surely be that parents must reflect on Catholic doctrine, on faith and morals, as revealed in the Scriptures, particularly in the Gospel, and as revealed by sacred tradition, that is, the teachings of the apostles, as transmitted faithfully from one generation to the next, at times infallibly from the time of Christ. What a blessing it is for parents then to hear the words of Christ in St. Matthew's Gospel. At that time Jesus answered and said, "I confess to thee, Father, O Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them to little ones. Yea, Father, for so it hath seemed good in thy sight." Parents today are not for the most part theological scholars, and they never have been since the time of Christ. However, countless unlearned but faithful Catholic parents both know and can confidently affirm, without fear of being contradicted by any authority in the world or in the next, that God's commandment, "Honour thy father and thy mother," reaffirmed by God the Son during his life on earth, establishes for all time that parents are the primary educators of their children and must guard them jealously. Faithful, unlearned Catholic parents are fully capable of understanding Christ's words concerning giving scandal to children. And I quote, "He that shall scandalise one of these little ones that believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone should be hanged about his neck and that he should be drowned in the depth of the sea." Catholic parents know, but must be reminded, that these words provide a terrible warning to those, including Catholic bishops, who promote the showing of pornographic images in the classroom to children young and old, and who allow false ideas about human sexuality, including homosexuality, to be taught in the classroom. In praying for our bishops this weekend, let me conclude by recalling once more the teaching of Pope Pius XI in Divini Ilius Magistri. And I think this is actually very timely, because people are always saying, well, what would you put in its place? Number 74. For the love of our Saviour Jesus Christ, therefore, we implore pastors of souls, by every means in their power, by instructions and catechisms, by word of mouth and written articles, widely distributed, to warn Christian parents of their grave obligations. And this should be done not in a merely theoretical and general way, but with practical and specific application to the various responsibilities of parents, touching the religious, moral and civil training of their children, and with indication of the methods best adapted to make their training effective, supposedly always the influence of their own exemplary lives.